Welcome. In this video, we are going to talk about conductivity. And yeah, here we go. Let me move that off the side. Okay, so when something conducts electricity, that means that what's happening inside the substance is there's movement of charged particles. And those charged particles can either be ions or electrons. So if a substance conducts electricity, there's charged particles moving around freely within that substance. That's a key takeaway there. In metals, what's happening is electrons are moving freely throughout the solid, conducting electricity. So that's what allows solid metals to conduct electricity, is those freely moving electrons. In a solution, what allows us some solutions to conduct electricity is dissolved ions. So if a substance, when dissolved in water, creates ions, remember, ions are charged particles. Those ions, when they're in the water, they move around freely. That allows that solution to conduct electricity. We'll also notice that the more ions that are dissolved, the greater the conductivity. So the more it conducts, the more dissolved ions there are in a solution. And a vocab term here for you, a solution that conducts electricity is called an electrolyte. So an electrolyte is a substance that dissolves in water to form a solution that conducts electricity. An example of an electrolyte would be an ionic compound. So ionic compounds, when you place them in water, they split apart and form these ions. So when they're in water, you've got these freely moving ions. And again, remember, ions are charged particles. And if you have charged particles moving around freely, then you can conduct. We will notice that most molecular covalent substances, so most covalent substances are non-electrolytes, because when you place them in water, they're not made of ions. So they tend to not conduct electricity. However, we do notice that some molecular covalent substances do conduct. There are these things called weak electrolytes. And we notice this happening with acids. So acids are a little unusual. They're covalent substances, but when they dissolve in water, they will actually split apart and form ions. Let me give an example. HCl, it's all nonmetals, so it's covalent bonding. But when you stick it in water, it actually breaks apart into ions. So that's why we observed in the lab that our salicylic acid conduct electricity when you put it in water. So acids are put a little asterisk by them. They're covalent, but when you put them in water, they actually form ions. So they're a little unusual there. Okay, so why do ionic solutions conduct? So again, conducting electricity requires free moving charged particles. So when an ionic solid dissolves, the ions, those charged particles, they separate out and they can move around freely in liquid water. So here's a side-by-side comparison, thinking of your solid ionic compound versus your dissolved salt. In this example, salt is what we're looking at when you dissolve it in water. So in the solid compound, we have ions, but they can't move. So you got the ions there, but they can't move, so it's not going to conduct. When you dissolve it in water, you've got the ions, and the ions can move freely. So that's why your aqueous solution dissolved in water, this solution will conduct electricity because it's got ions that can move around freely. And here's a picture. We mentioned metals earlier. Here's a picture of what's happening in the metals. The reason why metals can conduct electricity well is because the sea of electrons model, we think of these electrons as being kind of free flowing. They're not locked in any one particular place. They're just kind of moving all the way around through the solid. And since electrons are free to move, that's what allows metals to conduct electricity well. And here's a picture again of ionic solids. So ionic solids, they contain ions, but they can't move around. So that's why they do not conduct. So again, to summarize, the main idea here is in order to conduct electricity, you need to contain some sort of charged particles, either ions or electrons, that can move around freely. So in metals, you've got these electrons that can move around freely. And in ionic compounds, when you dissolve them in water, it's going to break apart into these individual ions, and they can move around freely. Thanks for watching.